Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Simkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and of course, live better. Thank you so very much for tuning into the show. Hello, E.C. How the heck are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. We are going to talk today about an updated definition of what healthy means. Should be pretty simple.
Simple, easy, quick.
We're going to cover a couple topics. We're going to talk about the old 1994 quote-unquote healthy food label system, how it worked and its limitations. We're going to talk about the new changes in the FDA's definition and what they can mean for us as consumers. And we're going to talk about whether labeling foods as quote-unquote healthy actually impacts our choices and our eating habits. So we're talking about some FDA regulations. Beyond that, give us a little bit of context so that we know what we're doing here.
Yeah, it was really at the end of last year, the FDA updated its final rule, its final definition on what defines, quote, healthy on a food label. It actually fits pretty well. We talked about some front of packaging label. Yeah. I feel like it was recently, but I went back, I think it was August. So I guess not that recently. But yeah, I mean, I think it fits pretty well with some of the stuff that they're trying to do, what looks like at that labeling. And I think it's pretty relevant to our listeners, right? What defines healthy? But yeah, as you kind of hinted at, I think this is one of these things that sounds so simple, but there's just like shades of gray and nuance. And so let's get into it.
Nothing around nutrition can be simple, can it?
I know.
You just can't.
I know.
Not even a label.
Not even a label.
Okay, so I said right at the top there was an old system from the mid-90s. Maybe let's start there. Give us a sense of even what that was before we talk about what the changes are going to be.
Yeah, so the 1994 rule really looked at specific nutrient levels. And one of the ways to be called healthy is it had to have limits on, let's say, total fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, and sodium. And so these were like these nutrients of concern that they're trying to limit. In addition to that, they have like nutrients that they were trying to encourage. So in addition to having lower levels of those, they wanted to have at least 10% of nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin C, calcium, and iron, trying to show that, hey, we've got low levels of these things that we want to cut back on, and we got higher levels of things that we need more of in the diet. You know, it's good that they weren't just looking at just sodium or just cholesterol, and they were looking at a collection of markers or a collection of nutrient values, but I would say it's a little bit compartmentalized, just sort of thinking about food as its individual constituents. Now, of course, some things have changed since 1994. It's kind of a trip thinking about this. It's like, okay, a few years later here. Some of the things that have changed is they have added sugars to food labels. So before it just used to show total sugars, which would combine things like the natural sugar occurring in strawberries and as well as added sugar. Well, now they will just delineate that out so you can truly see what's truly added versus what's naturally occurring. So that's been a big change, kind of in a realization and push within just our guidelines and our food labels. There's also been some realization that these old rules were kind of restrictive because there were foods that are truly healthy that weren't allowed to be called healthy. An example would be salmon because of its fat content. And then there were some foods that aren't so healthy but were allowed to be called healthy, like sweetened yogurts, just the way that the kind of looking at the individual nutrient pieces shook out. And then they've also done things where we don't actually require people to put vitamin A and vitamin C. These were nutrients of concern, but now we've sort of come to the place where those aren't really deficient in people, in Americans. And so now we're more concerned about things like potassium and vitamin D. And so those are now new requirements. So all of these kind of changes have been happening. But really the big push that's been a big change, and this is even true in the guidelines, is they're really trying to make this push for a dietary pattern. We talked about this with the Mediterranean Diet podcast, but it's this idea that like no one food makes or breaks your diet. Instead, we want to sort of see a collection of foods and a collection of their frequency and occurrence to determine the health of a diet. So it was all of these sort of changes, which of course, you know, have happened over 30 years. But they're like, let's go ahead and update it.
So just so I'm clear, because you mentioned the episode we did on labeling, is this literally the foods that are allowed to put the word healthy on the label versus foods that aren't allowed because they don't maybe fit into the whatever the criteria are? Is that like literally as literal as we're getting here, right?
Yeah, just to use the word, this is a healthy food. Now, this would be separate in addition to the packaging label that we discussed before of maybe they would list saturated fat and stuff, but this would just to be able to use the word healthy, yes.
Got it. Okay, cool. So what is the new system then? And when can we start to expect it if it's not already in circulation, when do we expect it to be?
Yeah, I think the final rule came out at the end of last year, and they're required to put it into place at the end of February, which has passed. But there has been, as you know, some shakeups with the administration that some stuff is on hold. So when exactly it will be rolled out might be end of March. We shall see. But yeah, it's supposed to be kind of right now that people are abiding to this new rule on healthy. And what this new rule is no surprise. They're incorporating kind of all of those changes that I've just mentioned. And the first one goes back to that idea about a healthy dietary pattern. They want the food, this is not going to sound like rocket science, but it is in terms of kind of food regulations. They want the food product to actually include some portion of the food group that they're trying to promote. So if you have a dairy product, they actually want that product to include some dairy. Not just some sort of flavoring and sugar and processed powder. They actually wanted to have some dairy in there. Mm-hmm. Now, this is going to be a great example of how these regulations get just too cumbersome for people to really use in their life. But they set limits on, okay, there has to be a certain amount of this food in the food product. So if we take dairy, for example, you have to have a 2/3 cup equivalent. If you think about different dairy products, like a cup of milk and an ounce of cheese, those might be considered equivalent because no one sits down to a cup of cheese. Maybe some people do, but it's just, you know what I mean? There's going to be these different serving sizes kind of based on the type of product it is. And so they look at things in terms of cup equivalents. And so if you want to have a healthy dairy product, you're going to have a 2/3 cup equivalent of dairy in that food, such that it actually is representative of the dairy food group. And this is, again, pushing people towards eating foods. And that's really what they recognized about the old system, that, yeah, they could cut out some saturated fat or they could cut down on the sodium. But then these food manufacturers could basically just fortify it, almost add a multivitamin, if you will, to the food product instead of actually having real food in it. And ultimately, you'd still have these kind of like calorically dense foods. So this is the way that they're trying to push us towards healthy food, which I think conceptually at least is great. Now, in addition to having this food as part of the food product, they still also have those other limitations on those nutrients of concern, which are now just added sugar, sodium, and saturated fat. So they've removed total fat. They're just looking at, okay, make sure that there's not too much of the added sugar, not too much of the sodium, and not too much of the saturated fat, in addition to having some real food in there. I should also mention that what we've been talking about so far is really for food products. Mm-hmm. All of the foods that I think our audience classically thinks of as healthy, or that we preach so much about, like real vegetables and real fruits and real whole grains that are just, one single ingredient like apple or like broccoli, those by default are already considered healthy. Mm-hmm. And they also allow things that are, let's say, very minimally processed, frozen strawberries that are just strawberries, right? Or dried beans. They're also allowing those to be considered healthy. Now, I think what's really interesting about that, all of those latter foods I just described, just strawberries or just frozen strawberries, they often don't have labels on them because they oftentimes don't come in packaging, right? And so I think it's just sort of interesting that we have all of these foods that are already healthy and they don't really need a label. Why are we spending so much time perfecting what healthy is instead of spending that time and resources to direct people towards eating those foods? We've got all of these foods that don't actually really need a label, don't even have a label on them. They're what we want people to eat. Instead, we're in the weeds of like, okay, well, how much dairy product is going to be in this, specific one that we can now put the label on?
You mentioned the food manufacturers finding the loopholes, maybe in the old system. To be able to continue to put healthy on there. Do you imagine that will just happen again with whatever these new rules are? Is it just another speed bump on the way to more unhealthy food being labeled as healthy?
I think it's going to be harder because, again, they have to have this food amount in the food. So they kind of have to have real dairy or they have to have real fruit in some type of fruit snack. Yep. It certainly will be harder than just to be some sort of concoction. But I still think when we look at these products, we're going to see a much higher caloric density than the foods that I just described, the fruits and veggies that often don't come with a label at all. And so Yeah, how much of a change this is really going to make, I don't know.
I want to get to a little bit more about the change that this may make. Before we do, though, you mentioned we did do an episode on labeling.
Mm.
I assume this, and maybe not, maybe I shouldn't assume that, but these things were done in tandem. In other words, like we're moving in the same direction and we're making rules that reflect each other or not. Are these reflective of each other, that the labels that we talked about in this new sort of quote unquote healthy label?
Yeah, it does seem like they are trying to make them congruent with one another. So what we talked about with the front of packaging label is they haven't set the final rule. They're allowing public comments through May. As all of these processes go, they're pretty long to get to. But what they were coming to is a decision that in addition to the nutrition label that's on the back, on the front of the packaging label, there would be some sort of box that highlights just saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. It would give the percent of the recommended daily allowance that the person is getting from a serving. And then it would also have these qualitative terms like high, medium, or low. So the person would see on the front of the box, oh, wow, this thing is high in saturated fat. It's giving me 25% of my daily needs or something like that. Now having the healthy label sort of also have something to do with saturated fat, added sugars, and sodium is good. There's some congruence there. The healthy label also means, again, that they have some type of real food in the product beyond kind of limiting those nutrients. But I do think it's good that they're going to have some parallels there. So it's not just like the healthy label is totally random and unrelated to the box that's on the front. I think that's a good thing. And yeah, there's some parallels there. But we'll see if that front of packaging label is passed and when that becomes a requirement.
Okay, then the $1 million question, does any of this matter? Does any of it matter, the new rules, in terms of what people eat, in terms of improving diets, improving a country's worth of diet?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of hinted this. I don't know how much this is going to do. Even when I was reading the final rule, which is a real page turner for defining healthy, even within that rule, the FDA is saying you can't live and die by this healthy label, that any food can be part of a healthy diet, and you shouldn't make all of your selections for your diet based on whether or not it has the healthy label. So the FDA knows that, the whole diet determines the health of it, and the presence or absence of one food can't tell us much about the whole diet. I mean, there are some healthy diets that include chocolate chip cookies, and there are unhealthy diets that include chocolate chip cookies, right? So they know this stuff, and they know it's much more comprehensive than just sort of slapping a healthy label on the front of it. And so it makes me pause a little bit because it's like, how many different labels and information do we already have on packaging? Like the back label, it already has so much information on it. Then we have that front of packaging label that we discussed. Then we have other organizations out there like the Whole30 or Paleo Certified or Keto that also get their check marks on the front. And I'm just sort of thinking, like, I don't really know that this is doing anything. How many more labels do we need on these boxes and bags of processed stuff so that we cut back on it? Like, I just am very skeptical that another label is going to do it. And I appreciate that nutrition change habits in small steps, and that maybe the nutrition label or the healthy label starts to get people a little bit interested. I think typically the people that are looking at nutrition labels are the ones that are kind of already on their way. They've already kind of made up their mind they want to change. And so maybe you could argue it's a value for them. But I'm just sort of like, when we look at a big, broad population change, is now the word healthy on the front really going to be this miraculous cure for our chronic disease epidemic? I don't know. So that's one big thought. The other big thought I had was, well, no wonder people are confused about nutrition. Here we have the government putting healthy on labels as a defining term. And then they also readily admit that a healthy diet isn't defined by eating the foods that have the health on the front of it. And guess what? I totally sympathize with their cause because food is complex and it's a mixture of nutrients and it depends on all the foods. And I get that. I certainly wouldn't want to be in charge on saying yes or no to what's healthy or not. But it does sort of make me smile a little bit. It's like, no wonder everyone is confused about nutrition, because people at the top of this whole system are saying, hey, let's put this label on the thing. But the label doesn't really mean everything. And you really have to think about other things and all of that stuff. And so sometimes, again, I'm like, I don't know that this is really going to be the solution if we can't even really come up with something that's kind of black or white and easy for the layperson to use.
Yeah. And we've talked about that a little bit, but maybe remind us what in this realm, in terms of helping people understand or communicating something that is admittedly complex as simply as possible so that people can make slightly better decisions over time. What are your recommendations? What would your recommendations be? How do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, to go from a labeling point of view, I do like kind of this ultra processed food categorization that we've talked about before. And really, they break food down into four different groups. Group one is kind of the unprocessed stuff, the fruits, the veggies, the meat, the eggs. Group two is just a little bit of extension of shelf life, things like olive oil or butter, that type of processing. Group three is going to have a few ingredients, maybe like a jam where it's just the fruit and the sugar. But then group four is this ultra processed, is what they call, but it's what I mean when I say processed. Ultra processed stuff that has all the additives that, really make these foods addictive. The stuff that we couldn't make in our own kitchen, like nobody can make Doritos in their own kitchen, right? That falls under the group four. And I think that grouping, even though they look at the ingredients and that's what defines them into putting them into the groups, I think what's good about this grouping is what falls under group four also are the foods that our behavior really changes around. Again, that addictive nature, we tend to overeat them. We tend not to have control. And so I would be okay with putting that type of label on those foods, like, hey, this is ultra processed. Now, I don't think a label is going to do it. I think in addition to having a label that follows that kind of nomenclature more than looking at necessarily saturated fat or added sugar, in addition to that, we also need to change the environment. Because I don't think it's just going to be a label thing. I think it'd be really interesting. Now, the grocers are not going to like this at all. It'd be really interesting if we had the grocery store set up in a way where the volume of foods that are truly healthy reflect the volume of which they should be in the diet. So let's just sort of say 80 to 90% of the store is the whole unprocessed stuff, and then 10 to 20% of the store is the ultra processed stuff. And the ultra processed stuff is all together in one section, and it's sort of like, hey, these are the food products that we have to minimize. Hey, here's the healthy foods that you should really encourage and stuff like that. Now, of course, they're not going to like that because they get a lot of money off of ultra processed, and that's what sells, and that's what people want. But I really don't see it as the label is going to change. It has to be maybe a label in addition to an environmental change to really push people towards consuming more of the foods that we should be, making it easier for them to consume it.
At the end of the day, is this just a way to try to, in your mind, regulate the processed foods from saying something that they're not, right? Like I understand, like, okay, it's got to do this. We've got to do this. It has to be this. But really at the end of the day, isn't all of this just like, stop calling it healthy? Like, to me, that's what it sounds like. But yeah. I can't tell you to stop calling it healthy. So I have to make rules that you have to follow in order to call it healthy. To me, it just feels like it's just, please stop doing this. And Here are some rules.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine the time, the resources, the money that has gone into defining healthy since 1994. Yeah. And I'm just sort of like, why don't we just organize the grocery store differently? Why don't we just take away the snack foods from checkouts? Why, again, when we walk into a Best Buy or a home goods store, it's overflowing with all of this stuff? Like, keep changing all the labels you want. And you are right that it's maybe like, the government can't really restrict the sale of products.
They can't tell Best Buy to stop selling Snickers bar at the checkout.
Right. So this is the best they can do, and they're going to keep refining their labels, and it's sort of this futile task, right? I do strongly believe that people can have ultra-processed food in their diet, and I would even argue that they should have some level of them because we like them and they are good. And so this is what's also gets a little bit problematic with even restricting stuff and trying to pull it out of the environment, is I think we should be allowed to have cake. I think we should be allowed to have cookies. It's just, okay, can we try another solution besides just another red label on the front of a box or a bag in hopes that that's really going to do anything?
Thank you, EC. Thanks everybody out there for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. They do help new folks find the show. So if you haven't left us a review on Apple Podcasts yet, please take a minute. We appreciate it when we see it. So thank you in advance. And EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project Podcast.